Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling something today that's what's fundamental to understanding a huge chunk of German history, but it's also really easily misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
The three Reichs, I think for a lot of people, when they hear Reich, their mind jumps straight to one specific, very dark period in the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's understandable, of course. But the term itself, it actually covers almost 1,000 years of history.
1,000 years. And three very, very different political, from the Middle Ages right up until, well, 1945.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how historical labels can be useful, shorthand.
Right.
But also incredibly misleading if you don't know the context behind them.
Yeah.
The sources we looked at, they do a good job of focusing on this numbering system, First, Second, Third Reich, and what each one actually was politically.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, then, to unpack those numbers.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We want to quickly but thoroughly get into what these labels mean. What were the timelines? What kind of state are we talking about for each one? And crucially, what were the sort of national ideas driving them?
Okay. So the big question is, why group these three vastly different? I mean, one lasted over 800 years, the other's less than 50, combined under the same German word.
Right.
And maybe more pointedly, what were the Nazis really trying to do by calling themselves the Third Reich? What power were they trying to tap into?
It's basically tracing the evolution of the idea of a German state. You go from this really loose, almost symbolic medieval setup.
The First Reich.
Yeah, to a much more recognizable, powerful, unified empire in the 19th century.
Second.
And then finally to that totalizing and tragically short-lived regime in the 20th century.
The third. Understanding the differences there is key for understanding modern Europe.
Absolutely fundamental.
So let's start right at the beginning, because I think a lot of the confusion stems from the word itself, Reich.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you said, the immediate association for many is with the Nazi era.
Right. Exclusive.
And while that association is deeply ingrained because of, history,
yeah.
Linguistically speaking, Reich is just the standard German word for, a kingdom or a state, an empire, a territory under rule.
So like realm in English, or maybe commonwealth, something quite broad.
Exactly. It's a functional term. It doesn't inherently carry the negative weight in German that it does for, say, English speakers, hearing it purely through the historical lens of the 1930s and 40s.
So the First, Second, and Third Reichs were just three sequential states or empires on German.
That's the basic idea. The word itself is neutral.
Okay.
It's the number, particularly the number 3 and the regime that claimed it, that carries the immense historical baggage.
Right, that makes sense. And you mentioned this neutrality helps explain how it can cover such different eras.
Precisely, which leads us straight into tackling that core misconception the sources highlight. The idea that Hitler was the Reich. People sometimes say that or think that.
Ah, okay. I see the problem there. It conflates the leader with the entire...
Exactly. And that distinction is absolutely critical, especially when you're talking about totalitarianism.
So break it down. Hitler was
the Führer, the leader. He was the head of the state, the country, that was known as the Third Reich.
But the Reich itself, that's the institution, the state apparatus.
Yes, the Reich is the state, the empire, the whole governmental structure. If you just focus on the leader, you can miss the bureaucratic machinery of control, the way the system itself functions.
That's a really important point. The Third Reich wasn't just one man. It was a huge, complex system of power and structure.
A system that in many ways drew on existing German state structures, even as it radically warped. Confusing the leader with the state overlooks that institutional aspect.
It's almost like a linguistic safeguard, thinking about it that way. It forces us to look beyond just the great man theory of history.
Right.
We're studying the vessel, the state structure, the political idea that allowed that individual to gain and wield such terrifying power.
And we really need to keep that distinction in mind.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the First Reich next, we're talking about a system where the leader, the emperor, often had less real power than some of the princes underneath him.
Wow, okay. So the same word, Reich, described that situation and the Third Reich.
Yes, the term is the same, but the reality of the power represented, radically different across.
Okay, let's go back in time, way back, to Reich number 1. So the First Reich, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And that name itself, the sources point out, it's maybe one of the most famously confusing or debated labels in history.
It really is. But the first thing that jumps out, I think, is its sheer lifespan.
Yeah, the duration is staggering.
We're talking 962 AD to 1806.
So 844 years.
844 years. Think about that for a second. Compare it to the other two. The Third Reich lasted 12 years, if it had lasted as long as the first.
It would end in the year 2074 or something.
Exact. Just puts it in perspective. This thing survived the Middle Ages, the Black Death, the Crusades, the Reformation, countless wars.
Its longevity just dwarfs the other two combined by like a factor of 10 almost.
Which tells you immediately it must have been a completely different kind of political animal.
Right. It couldn't have been a tightly controlled, centralized state like we think of today.
Absolutely not. Despite the grand name and the huge territory it claimed across Central Europe, it was never a unified nation state in the modern.
So what was it then? The sources call it a confederation.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. A complex, often messy confederation. It was made up of hundreds, sometimes even thousands of separate bits.
What kind of bits?
Principalities, kingdoms, duchy, free imperial cities like Hamburg or Frankfurt, powerful bishopric. All these territories with varying degrees of autonomy, all loosely under the emperor.
A patchwork quilt, essentially.
A very complex patchwork quilt, held together not by strong central government, but more by shared culture, language, to some extent, legal traditions.
And the idea of the emperor.
And the idea of the emperor, the Kaisertum, plus a very formal, elaborate system for trying to make collective decisions.
You mean the imperial diet, the Reichstag.
Exactly. But it wasn't a parliament like we'd imagine today, making laws for a nation. It was more like a permanent diplomatic conference.
Okay.
It was where all the major rulers within the empire, the electors who chose the emperor, the other powerful princes, representatives from the cities would meet. They'd negotiate. They'd give consent to imperial policies, or quite often, they'd just block whatever the emperor wanted to do.
So the emperor wasn't some all-powerful Roman-style Caesar, despite the name.
Not usually, no, especially later on. His title was prestigious, incredibly so, but his actual power to enforce his will across the entire empire, often quite limited. He depended on the cooperation of these powerful local.
And didn't that become even more true after events like the 30 Years' War?
Absolutely. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is a key turning point. It basically formalized the political independence, the sovereignty of the constituent states within the empire.
So it weakened the central authority further.
Massively. Many historians argue that Westphalia really marked the beginning of the end for the HRE as a significant political force, even though it limped on for another century and a half.
Which leads to that famous quote, right, from Voltaire.
Oh, yes. That the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
It's cynical, but it captures that gap between the grand title and the decentralized reality, doesn't it?
Perfectly. It claimed this amazing lineage, this ultimate authority, but in practice it was often cumbersome, slow, and politically fragmented.
Let's unpack the name itself, though. Why holy? Why Roman?
Okay, so Roman, that was a very deliberate...
Connecting back to ancient Rome.
Direct. Starting with Otto Horgist, who was crowned emperor in 962, the idea was to position themselves as the legitimate successors to the Western Roman Empire.
So claiming that imperial tradition, that universal authority in the secular world.
Exactly. It was a claim to be the supreme temporal rulers in Christian Europe.
And the holy part, where does that...
That cemented the connection with the church, with the papacy, and with the idea of Christian faith. It linked the emperor's rule to a divine mandate.
So blending political power with religious authority to create ultimate legitimacy?
Precisely. It was an attempt to make the emperor's position unchallengeable, ordained by God. This combination of historical legacy and divine right is a big part of why it lasted so long, even when it was politically weak.
It wasn't about efficiency then, it was about stability through tradition.
I think that's a good way to see it. It provided this overarching framework, this shared identity, however loose, and a common legal understanding that endured for centuries until Napoleon. In 1806, after decisively defeating the Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz, Napoleon basically forced the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, to abdicate and dissolve the empire.
He just declared it over.
Pretty much. He was reorganizing Central Europe into his own system. The Confederation of the Rhine and the old HRE structure was just in the way. He refused to recognize its existence.
Was it already dead by then, politically speaking? Was Napoleon just tidying up?
Many historians would say yes. Its political relevance had been fading for a long, long time, certainly since the 17th century. Napoleon's actions just removed the final legal scaffolding.
And forced people to confront the fact that this medieval imperial idea was gone.
Right, and the vacuum left by his final collapse. That directly fuels the next phase, the rise of nationalism and the intense push for a truly unified German state.
Which brings us to a completely different kind of right. Number 2.
Yeah, and if the First Reich was defined by its longevity and decentralization, the Second Reich is almost the opposite. It marks this really rapid, quite violent shift away from that medieval system.
Towards what?
Towards modern nationalism, towards state consolidation, towards industrial power, and critically, towards Prussian dominance.
It's a jarring transition, isn't it? You go from 844 years
Right.
straight into an era, the Second Reich, that only lasts 47, from 1871 to 1980.
47 years. It's incredibly short compared to the First Reich, but what a 47 years.
Yeah, arguably some of the most transformative and consequential decades in modern European history.
Absolutely. That relative brevity, I think, reflects the incredible speed of change in the late 19th century. Industrialization, nationalism, the escalating competition between great powers.
And Germany, during the Second Reich period, emerges as a dominant force.
A massive economic and military superpower. It completely reshaped the balance of power.
And the person most responsible for its creation, the architect. We have to talk about Otto von Bismarck.
You simply can't discuss the Second Reich without understanding Bismarck's role. He was the minister-president of Prussia, the largest and most powerful German state at the time.
And he was the driving force behind unification.
He was the political engine. The sources often mention his famous phrase, unification wouldn't be achieved by speeches and majority decision. That was the failure of the liberal revolutions of 1848, but by blood and iron, meaning war and military strength. This wasn't a peaceful merging of states based on popular will. No. It was unification, orchestrated by Prussia, achieved through a series of carefully calculated and successful wars.
Against who?
First against Denmark in 1864, then crucially against Austria in 1866, which removed Austria as a rival for leadership among the German states, and finally the decisive Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871.
And it was the victory against France that sealed the deal.
Yes, the wave of nationalist fervor following the victory over France allowed Bismarck to persuade the southern German state, which had been hesitant, to join the new German Empire.
And where was it declared? The symbolism seems important.
Incredibly symbolic. The German Empire, the Second Reich, was proclaimed on January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, outside Paris.
Wow, in the palace of the defeated French king.
Exactly. A deliberate symbol of military triumph and the shift in European power.
Okay, so we mentioned the contrast earlier. Reich I survived centuries of turmoil, but Reich II couldn't even survive its first major global war, World War I. What does that tell us?
It's a stark lesson, isn't it? It suggests that these modern unified nation states, especially those forged through military power and intense nationalism, while they can be incredibly powerful externally, they might be internally brittle. Their legitimacy is often tied very closely to continued success, especially military.
So when that success failed in 1918,
the entire structure collapsed. Bismarck's genius was using external conflict to forge internal unity, but the system he created ultimately couldn't withstand catastrophic external.
Let's talk about the leadership structure. It wasn't like the Holy Roman Emperor, right?
No, completely different. The Second Reich was officially the Deutsches Kaiserreich, the German Empire. It was led by the German emperors, the Kaisers.
Starting with Wilhelm I, who was also the king of Prussia.
Right. That's key. It was technically a federal empire made up of various kingdoms, duchies, and free cities, but it was absolutely dominated by Prussia. Prussian political ideas, Prussian military values, Prussian bureaucracy.
And the Kaiser, was he just a figurehead?
Oh, no. He was a hereditary monarch, not elected like the old HRE emperor, and he wielded significant constitutional power, especially over the military and foreign policy. The chancellor, like Bismarck, was appointed by and answered to the Kaiser, not necessarily the parliament, the Reichstag.
So a constitutional monarchy, but a strong one, weighted towards the emperor and the conservatives.
Exactly. It had a parliament elected by universal male suffrage, which was quite progressive for the time. But the government wasn't fully responsible to that parliament in the way we understand parliamentary democracy today. Power remained concentrated with the Kaiser and his chancellor.
What else was driving the state besides Prussian military? You mentioned industrial.
Explosive. Germany underwent a period of incredibly rapid industrialization during the Second Reich.
Catching up with Britain.
Catching up, and in some areas, surpassing Britain. Huge growth in coal mining, iron, and steel production, especially in the Ruhr Valley. The chemical and electrical industries became world leaders. Railway networks expanded dramatically.
And this economic power fueled its ambitions.
Absolutely. It funded a massive military buildup, particularly the Navy under Kaiser Wilhelm II, who succeeded his grandfather, Wilhelm I.
This is the era of Weltpolitik.
Yes, Wilhelm II's world policy. This ambitious, and many would say aggressive, drive to make Germany a true global power, acquire colonies, challenge British naval supremacy, it dramatically increased international tension.
So, thinking big picture here, the foundations of modern Germany, the unified state, the industrial powerhouse, the strong military tradition, that intense nationalism, it really solidifies right here in the Second Reich.
Without a doubt. This period fundamentally reshaped Germany and Europe. It created the economic and political realities and also the geopolitical fault lines that led directly into the First World War.
And the end.
The end came with defeat in World War I in November 1918. Military collapse led to revolution at home, the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the proclamation of a republic, the Weimar Republic.
So, born in military victory, died.
A stark symmetry. And that collapse, the perceived humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic instability that followed, all of that created the conditions, the deep sense of grievance and crisis that the next Reich would ruthlessly exploit.
To power.
A profound, which leads us directly to the Third Reich, a regime that consciously tried to wrap itself in the mantle of the first two.
Okay, so the Third Reich. We shift now from, traditional imperial structures, whether they were decentralized like the first or a constitutional monarch second, into something radically different.
Radically different. We're entering the realm of modern totalitarian ideology. The formal state is Nazi Germany. But that name they chose, Third Reich, that was a very deliberate, very calculated piece of propaganda.
Right, we touched on why did they do it? Why did Hitler and the Nazis specifically link themselves to the Holy Roman Empire and Bismarck's Germany?
Legitimacy. They needed to manufacture a sense of historical inevitability and legitimacy for what was, in reality, a revolutionary and brutal seizure of power.
So it wasn't just a new government, it was positioning themselves as the culmination of history.
Exactly. By calling themselves the Third Reich, they weren't presenting themselves as a break from the past, even though they were. They were framing their regime as the logical, destined fulfillment of German history.
Like they were inheriting and perfecting the legacies.
Precisely. The narrative they pushed was something like, the First Reich gave us the German spirit, the imperial idea, the vast historical territory. The Second Reich gave us national unity, industrial might, military strength.
And we, the Third Reich, are now combining all of that into the final, perfect, enduring form of the German state.
You've got it. It's incredibly potent political branding. They explicitly called it the 1,000-year Reich.
1,000.
Think about that claim. They were trying to evoke the longevity of the First Reich while promising the power of the Second, all wrapped up in their own ideology. The goal was to give their rule this almost mythical, authoritative status, to seem permanent, inevitable.
And to completely erase the memory or legitimacy of the democratic Weimar Republic that came immediately before them, right? The one that lasted only...
Absolutely. They portrayed Weimar as a period of failure, weakness, and national humiliation, and positioned themselves as the strong, historically rooted alternative destined for great.
How did the actual political structure compare? We talked about the Kaiser having const, even if he was powerful. What about the Führer?
Total different. The Third Reich swept away any meaningful constraints on power almost immediately through things like the Reichstag Fire Decree and then the Enabling Act of 1933. These effectively suspended civil liberties and allowed Hitler and his cabinet to rule by decree, bypassing the Constitution and the Parliament entirely.
So no checks, no balance.
None. Federalism was dismantled, opposition parties were banned, the courts were subordinated to the Nazi Party. Where the First Reich was decentralized and the Second was a centralized federation, the Third Reich became a completely unitary, totalitarian dictatorship. All power flowed from the top of the Führer.
Which brings up that question again. What happens when a state rests entirely on one individual unbound law?
It can generate immense focused power in the short term. It allows for rapid, decisive action, often brutal act, but it also creates profound fragility.
No, so...
Because the entire system becomes dependent on the leader's will and ideology. There's no room for error, no mechanism for peaceful succession or correction. Totalitarian states rely on constant mobilization, ideological purity, and repression. They're inherently brittle compared to systems with established rules and distributed power.
Unlike the First Reich, which could sort of bend and adapt over centuries.
Or the Second Reich, which collapsed due to external military factors.
The Third Reich seemed almost programmed for self-destruction.
Its ideology, particularly its relentless expansionism and racial hatred, set it on a collision course with the rest of the world from the very beginning.
Which leads us to the ultimate brutal irony, the time.
Yeah, the regime that called itself the 1,000-year Reich
lasted just 12 years, 1933 to 1945.
A mere blip in historical terms. And it didn't just end. It ended in utter catastrophe, total military defeat, the physical destruction of large parts of Germany, the division of the country, and its complete occupation by the Allied power.
So the failure wasn't just political, it was total. It completely discredited the very idea of linking their regime to the previous Reichs.
Absolutely. That catastrophic failure, the failure to deliver anything close to the promised 1,000 years of glory, marked the definitive end of the Reich concept in German political discourse.
Nobody wanted to touch that word afterwards.
Nobody. The post-war German states, Both West and East Germany, the Federal Republic and the German Democratic Republic, deliberately and completely rejected that imperial terminology. They built new political identities explicitly against the legacy of the Third Reich.
The name was all about projecting power and destiny.
But the reality was 12 years of unimaginable violence and destruction, ending in absolute ruin.
Okay, so let's pull back and look at the naming system itself one more time. We've established why they're all called Reich.
Standard German word for state or realm.
But the numbers first, second, third, that's the key organizing principle here, isn't it?
It really is. It's the essential historical shorthand. Without those numbers, trying to talk about German political history from the Middle Ages to the 20th century would be incredibly confusing.
They immediately signal which distinct era, which type of governance we're talking about.
Exactly. They impose a clear chronological and structural order on nearly a millennium of complex history.
So let's quickly recap the core distinction each number represents.
Okay.
The First Reich, 962, the Holy Roman Empire. Key idea, decentralization.
Right. A long-lasting, sprawling, but ultimately weak medieval confederation built on tradition, imperial ideas, and a connection to religious legitimacy.
Then the Second Reich, 1871 to 9, Bismarck's German Empire. Key idea, centralization.
Yes, a powerful, unified, modern nation-state, a constitutional monarchy dominated by Prussia, fueled by industrial might and militaristic much shorter lifespan.
And finally, the Third Reich, 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany. Key idea, totalitarian.
The shortest-lived and the most destructive. An absolute dictatorship built on radical ideology, which deliberately co-opted the Reich terminology to claim historical legitimacy for its brutal agenda.
So the numbers are more than just labels, they're like instant context flags.
Absolutely. When someone says Second Reich Germany, you immediately picture the Kaiser, Bismarck, spiked helmets, industrial factories, the build-up to World War I.
You don't picture medieval knights or Nazi stormtroopers.
Exactly. The numbers provide that crucial framework for understanding which Germany we're discussing.
So for someone trying to get a solid grasp of this period, what's the main takeaway? The numbers are useful shorthand.
But understanding the profound political and structural differences behind those numbers is absolutely essential. It's about recognizing the huge shifts in how German lands were governed over time.
Yeah, the political weight behind each number is immense. Understanding the First Reich helps you see why German unification was such a struggle for so long.
Right, and why it eventually happened under Prussian military leadership.
Understanding the Second Reich explains Germany's rapid rise as a modern, but also the tensions that led to the world wars.
And understanding the Third Reich, especially its need to call itself the Third, tells you so much about how modern dictatorships use and abuse history for propaganda purposes.
It's incredible how much is packed into that simple numbering. You're really talking about the journey from, like, an emperor who needed permission from hundreds of princes
to a Kaiser who commanded a massive modern army but still operated within a constitution.
To a Führer who was the law, accountable to no one.
That progression or regression, depending on how you look at the final stage, that dramatic shift in the nature of state power is the real story encapsulated in the concept of the Three Reich. #out.
So we've covered almost 1,000 years from this sprawling and decentralized medieval empire that lasted over 8 centuries.
Through a unified industrial empire that burned brightly but briefly for less than 50 years.
To a totalitarian state that claimed 1,000 years but collapsed in just 12. All connected by this one word, Reich, numerical.
And I think the big lesson that resonates, maybe beyond just German history, is about the power of political language, power of claiming continuity.
Especially for regimes that are actually radical breaks from the past.
Exactly. New, often unstable or revolutionary regimes like the Third Reich, they almost instinctively reach back and try to wrap themselves in the legitimacy of older, more established, or historically significant state.
They needed that connection to the First and Second Reichs to seem less like a sudden violent aberration and more like death.
It helps mask their radicalism, their fragility sometimes. It creates this veneer of historical inevitability. It's a much easier sell politically to say we are the next logical step rather than we are something completely new and potentially terrifying.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And maybe that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener. Think about other examples in history.
Where else have regimes done this?
Yeah. Where else, across different cultures and time periods, have new states, maybe republics claiming Roman virtues, or restored monarchies claiming ancient rights, or even revolutionary governments claiming to fulfill some long-lost national destiny? Where have they tried to borrow legitimacy by claiming the mantle of a previous, often very different?
What's that deep psychological need for a modern political anchor itself, even if it's a bit of a stretch?
It seems to be a recurring theme. This idea of historical continuity, almost a weapon, recognizing when and how. That feels like a pretty crucial part of critical politics past.